Let's start by asking the question that nobody in the mainstream media seems willing to ask. Why is the United States, the richest country in the world, trying to strong arm its neighbor into surrendering control of its own ports? This isn't just a story about Donald Trump, about Mark Carney, or about a trade spat between two countries. This is a story about power, about economics, and about a system that constantly breeds conflict because of the way it's organized. And if you think this is just about Canada, think again, because the ripple effects of this humiliation will be felt across the entire global economy. When Donald Trump demanded control over Canadian ports, it wasn't merely a unilateral policy suggestion or a passing statement in the news cycle. What we witnessed was a concentrated expression of the pressures and contradictions inherent in American capitalism. Consider the audacity of such a demand. A neighboring country, a nation with its own sovereign economy, being asked to hand over control of strategic infrastructure simply because the United States desires it. And yet, this is exactly the logic of a system built on the accumulation of wealth at the top. The U.S. economy is structured in such a way that corporations and political elites must constantly expand markets, secure resources, and control supply chains. Ports are not neutral spaces, they are the literal gateways through which goods, raw materials, and profits flow. To control them is to control commerce, to control wealth, and ultimately to dictate terms to entire populations. The question is not whether Canada should comply. The question is why a superpower feels entitled to impose such control in the first place, and what this tells us about the desperation of contemporary American capitalism. The demand also functions as a political signal, both domestically and internationally. For domestic audiences, Trump frames such moves as assertive, protective, and patriotic, but the underlying message is clear. When the system is under strain, the solution, according to elites, is coercion. American corporations face competition from global markets, rising labor costs, and technological shifts that threaten traditional profit margins. In this context, ports become more than infrastructure. They are strategic tools in the game of maintaining economic dominance. Every ship that enters a port, every container that passes through customs represents potential profit or loss. By attempting to control Canadian ports, Trump and his administration aim to secure the physical and logistical channels that feed U.S. corporate profit, demonstrating that in capitalism, sovereignty is secondary to accumulation. The demand also exposes the brittle assumptions of American global authority. For decades, the narrative has been that the United States can dictate terms anywhere, at any time, and that allies will comply out of economic dependency or geopolitical fear. But even before Carney's refusal, the very act of making such a demand reflects anxiety. It is the admission that soft influence may no longer be sufficient, that coercion may be required to maintain advantage. There is a subtle but telling tension here. A nation boasting unmatched military power and economic reach is reduced to issuing ultimatums to its neighbors in order to secure control over basic trade infrastructure. The audacity of the move functions as a hook in itself. It captures attention because it defies conventional expectations of diplomacy, but it also reveals vulnerability masked as bravado. Furthermore, Trump's demand illustrates a recurring pattern in capitalist states: the conflation of national interest with corporate profit. When a government speaks of protecting jobs or defending trade, it often masks the fact that the beneficiaries are not workers, but shareholders and executives. Controlling Canadian ports would have allowed U.S. corporations to reduce operational costs, streamline logistics, and secure pricing advantages, reinforcing profit hierarchies while offering little, if any, tangible benefit to the average worker. This is a critical point to grasp. The mechanisms of capitalism are designed to concentrate wealth and power, and political maneuvers like this one are the means through which such concentration is enforced. It is an example of systemic coercion disguised as national security, an almost theatrical display of authority intended to impress both domestic and international observers. Finally, the move also carries significant symbolic weight. Ports are gateways, and the attempt to control them is a metaphor for control over trade, over markets, and over the flow of wealth itself. The audacity of the demand hooks public attention precisely because it challenges expectations. How can a country with global influence act so aggressively toward a friendly neighbor and expect compliance? The answer lies not in personal temperament, but in systemic imperatives. Capitalism demands constant expansion, constant control, and constant accumulation. When those demands are frustrated, leaders respond with pressure tactics, ultimatums, and in this case, an attempt to seize physical control over a sovereign nation's economic lifelines. It is a moment that exposes the tensions between rhetoric and reality, between assumed dominance and actual influence, and between the interests of capital and the sovereignty of nations. Mark Carney's refusal to yield to Donald Trump's demand is not simply a routine diplomatic response. It is a deliberate assertion of sovereignty and a profound statement about the limits of coercive power in international relations. To the casual observer, it may seem like a straightforward "no" in a trade negotiation, but the implications are far deeper and far more revealing. Canada's stance exposes a critical tension in the global capitalist order. The idea that even the world's most powerful nations cannot unilaterally dictate terms to others without encountering resistance. In an era when American dominance is often taken for granted, Carney's firm refusal functions as a wake-up call. It is a reminder that sovereignty, while increasingly pressured by global economic integration, remains a potent tool when wielded decisively. The hook here is that power is never absolute. It is negotiated, contested, and sometimes challenged in ways that expose the vulnerabilities of even the richest, most militarily equipped nations. Carney's decision is also emblematic of a broader understanding of national interest that contrasts sharply with the U.S. approach under Trump. Whereas the American demand was framed in terms of profit maximization, strategic advantage, and corporate benefit, the Canadian response emphasizes control over national assets and the long-term health of the domestic economy. Ports are not abstract conduits. They are essential infrastructure tied to trade flows, employment, and economic stability. By refusing, Carney is signaling that no foreign power, regardless of wealth or political clout, can override Canada's ability to manage its own economic lifelines. The refusal is a strategic demonstration that sovereignty is not merely symbolic but instrumental, that controlling one's own trade channels remains a cornerstone of national economic security. This is a subtle yet powerful lesson in how smaller or medium-sized economies navigate the pressures imposed by larger, more aggressive partners in a capitalist system structured around competition and exploitation. The refusal also carries psychological and political weight, functioning as both a domestic and international message. Domestically, it reassures Canadians that their government will not bow to intimidation, that national assets are not commodities to be bartered under threat. Internationally, it sets a precedent, signaling to other nations that the assumption of automatic U.S. compliance is flawed. In doing so, Canada effectively exposes a contradiction in American trade policy, the projection of unchallenged authority versus the reality of its limits. The hook lies in the dramatic irony. The country often portrayed as the global superpower must now confront the fact that its demands are negotiable, that resistance is not only possible but enforceable, and that reputation alone cannot compel compliance. Carney's refusal transforms a routine trade disagreement into a symbolic challenge to U.S. hegemony. Moreover, the Canadian stance highlights the recurring theme in capitalism where states act in defense of their own ruling classes, yet the rhetoric of resistance can create the perception of a moral or strategic high ground. Carney is not standing up for workers in the United States or Canada. He is standing up for the Canadian elite and for the preservation of profit, generating infrastructure under Canadian control. Nevertheless, the refusal resonates because it disrupts the narrative of inevitable American dominance, creating a space to question the systemic logic that allows powerful nations to dictate terms while presenting them as necessary for the good of global markets. This tension is central to understanding contemporary global trade, what is often framed as moral or strategic decision making is, at its core, a negotiation over the distribution and control of wealth. Carney's refusal is a moment where strategy, sovereignty, and systemic contradictions collide, making the political theater highly instructive for anyone seeking to understand the mechanics of global capitalism. The implications of the refusal extend beyond a single trade negotiation. They underscore the reality that no nation, regardless of its economic size, can operate in isolation within a system of interdependent markets. Every demand, every coercive move encounters friction, and these points of resistance reveal the fragility of assumed dominance. The hook here is that even the most powerful actors, accustomed to leveraging military, financial, and political might, must navigate the constraints imposed by the global network of sovereign economies. Carney's refusal turns a transactional demand into a public lesson that power, however formidable, is always relational, contingent, and challenged by the very system that produces it. Finally, the refusal opens the door to critical reflection on the dynamics of modern trade. It illustrates the limits of economic intimidation and raises the question of how capitalist states, even those at the top, maintain control without provoking resistance. Carney's stance is not just a defense of Canadian ports, it is a demonstration of strategic negotiation within a system designed to maximize profits for some while subordinating others. By saying no, Carney exposes the pressure points of global capitalism and reminds us that compliance is never guaranteed, that sovereignty and strategy can disrupt even the most aggressive attempts at domination, and that in the global economy, power must always be earned, maintained, and contested. The rejection of Trump's demands by Canada is more than a single diplomatic setback. It is a glaring reflection of the limits of U.S. global influence in the 21st century. For decades, American policymakers operated under the assumption that economic and military power could translate almost automatically into compliance from allies and even reluctant competitors. The audacity of Trump's demand exposes the fragility of that assumption. When a neighbor refuses to hand over control of its own ports, it sends a signal not just to Washington, but to the entire world. Influence, no matter how extensive, is conditional. The hook here is undeniable. The most powerful economy on the planet is confronted with a simple refusal, and that refusal carries consequences far beyond the immediate trade dispute. It signals a shift in global dynamics, one that has implications for diplomacy, commerce, and the perception of American authority. The implications for U.S. credibility are profound. Nations that once acquiesced to American economic dictates may begin to reconsider the cost of compliance. If a country like Canada, economically tied to the U.S., geographically close, and historically cooperative, can resist demands without catastrophic repercussions, what precedent does that set for other nations? The refusal chips away at the myth of unchallengeable American dominance and exposes the performative nature of power. The U.S. can deploy rhetoric, threaten tariffs, or wave military might, but when confronted with principled refusal from an ally, even these instruments of influence can be ineffective. The hook lies in the irony. Strength is projected through aggression, yet real world compliance is never guaranteed. This episode also reveals the strategic overreach inherent in American economic policy, the logic behind the demand. Securing control over Canadian ports to ensure the free flow of goods and maintain economic leverage reflects a narrow, profit-driven calculus. It prioritizes corporate interests and geopolitical positioning over diplomatic nuance or mutual benefit. However, the refusal exposes the vulnerability of this approach. When nations resist, the very strategies designed to guarantee dominance can backfire, undermining credibility and creating friction in relationships that are supposed to be cooperative. For policymakers, the lesson is stark. Influence cannot be imposed indefinitely without acknowledgement of other nations' sovereignty and agency. The hook here is subtle, but powerful overreach breeds humiliation, and humiliation in turn diminishes soft power, the persuasive capacity of a state to shape global outcomes without coercion. Moreover, the broader economic implications cannot be ignored. U.S. trade relies on complex networks of interdependent markets, logistical infrastructure, and multinational agreements. By attempting to seize control of Canadian ports, the U.S. highlighted its dependency on cooperation rather than self-sufficiency. The refusal makes clear that even the most powerful nation remains enmeshed in a web of relationships that cannot be dominated unilaterally. In other words, globalization has created a paradox. The ability to project influence is constrained by the very interdependence that allows for vast economic reach. The hook is in the contradiction itself. The more interconnected the global economy becomes, the less absolute the power of any single nation. Finally, the episode underscores the symbolic dimension of humiliation in international affairs. Humiliation is not merely a matter of pride, it has tangible consequences for political leverage, negotiation strength, and domestic legitimacy. For the United States, being publicly resisted by Canada undermines the narrative of invincible economic authority. For observers worldwide, it is a cautionary tale about the limits of force and intimidation in achieving compliance. The hook here is dramatic. A superpower accustomed to commanding global attention and obedience finds itself negotiating from a position of exposed vulnerability. This shift, subtle as it may seem, has repercussions for trade agreements, diplomatic negotiations, and the perception of American reliability as an international partner. It reminds us that power in global economics, as in everyday life, is never absolute. It is always conditional, contested, and tested by those willing to say no. Beyond the immediate diplomatic drama, the confrontation over Canadian ports reveals fundamental truths about the structure of global capitalism and the relentless pursuit of control that defines it. This is not simply a clash between two national leaders or a negotiation over shipping logistics. It is a demonstration of how the capitalist system compels powerful states and corporations to constantly expand their reach, to dominate resources, and to secure economic advantages wherever they can. The hook here is stark and unavoidable. Every trade demand, every attempt to seize control of infrastructure is rooted in the imperatives of a system designed to concentrate wealth and power at the top. The U.S. demand for Canadian ports exemplifies the ongoing tension between the logic of accumulation and the realities of sovereignty. The capitalist drive to control trade routes, markets, and production channels is relentless because profits depend on minimizing costs and maximizing efficiency. Ports are more than strategic locations, they are nodes in a global network through which raw materials, manufactured goods, and financial flows circulate. Control over these nodes translates directly into control over profits. The demand for Canadian ports, therefore, is not an isolated act of overreach. It is a predictable consequence of the structural imperatives of capitalism. Companies and governments alike must secure advantages to stay competitive, and when the system is under pressure, due to competition, declining margins, or shifting geopolitics, the pressure often manifests as coercive demands and aggressive economic maneuvers. The hook lies in the hidden logic. The very system that produces wealth for a few compels states to attempt domination at the expense of others, often generating conflict in the process. This episode also illustrates the recurring pattern of economic conflicts between nations where workers, consumers, and ordinary citizens are rarely the primary beneficiaries. While the headlines focus on Trump and Carney, the reality is that both American and Canadian elites are maneuvering to protect corporate and financial interests. Workers in both countries are largely spectators in a game designed for the accumulation of capital. Ports employ thousands of workers, and their operations affect local economies, yet the political spectacle of demands and refusals treats these human dimensions as secondary to strategic calculations. The hook is unsettling. The structures of global capitalism allow dramatic confrontations to unfold in which ordinary people bear the risk and disruption, while elites reap the rewards of controlling the flows of trade. Another systemic lesson emerges from the very humiliation experienced by the U.S. trade apparatus. Humiliation is not incidental, it is part of the story that capitalism often produces when its imperatives collide with resistance. The refusal by Canada demonstrates that even a superpower's pursuit of economic advantage is constrained by the existence of other sovereign actors. Markets may be global, but sovereignty is local, and tensions between the two create inevitable conflicts. The hook is compelling. Capitalism promises expansion and dominance, yet the reality of resistance, regulatory limits, and political friction exposes the fragility and contradictions of that promise. What appears as strength, the audacity of demanding control over a neighbor's infrastructure, is revealed as vulnerability when resistance occurs. Finally, the broader implication is that these clashes are not anomalies, but recurring features of the global economic system. Every trade war, every demand for concessions, and every attempt to control resources or infrastructure is an illustration of the systemic pressures of capitalism in motion. The U.S. demand and Canada's refusal are a microcosm of a global pattern, powerful actors pushing to maximize profit, smaller or equally capable actors resisting exploitation, and workers caught in the middle. The hook is undeniable. The spectacle of national humiliation and resistance is inseparable from the structural imperatives of capitalism itself, reminding us that economic crises, conflicts, and tensions are not accidents. They are the predictable outcomes of a system designed for accumulation, competition, and control.